Welcome back to This Is Fine, the podcast where we confront the cracks in our seemingly perfect veneer of technology and cybersecurity, especially in the government and critical infrastructure systems. I'm your host, Matt Triner, CEO of Hunter Strategy. At Hunter Strategy, we don't shy away from hard questions or complex challenges. Instead, we thrive in exploring the intricate world of cybersecurity threats and solutions. Today, we're diving into a highly specialized and yet universally significant topic: secure firmware development for embedded systems, a foundational discipline that directly impacts the integration of modern technology and the security of the interconnected world that we live in. To unpack this topic, I'm thrilled to welcome two seasoned experts in this space. First, we welcome back Jake Williams, our VP of Research and Development at Hunter Strategy. Jake is a pragmatic innovator and industry veteran who doesn't just theorize about security, he builds it into systems that operate in some of the most sensitive and high stakes environments that you can imagine. With a reputation as a modern day cyber tactician, Jake is known for being on the front lines of defending against advanced threats, researching vulnerabilities, and driving security development practices. Joining Jake is Mick Douglas, managing partner at InfoSec Innovations. Mick combines technical mastery with strategic insight, forging excellence in cybersecurity practices across diverse sectors. His professional experience spans influential roles at organizations such as Diebold, Black Hills Information Security, and Binary Defense. He's also a certified STANS Institute instructor known for training some of the industry's best and brightest. Mick's passion for secure systems is deeply rooted in both technical rigor and real-world experience of the stakes involved in today's rapidly evolving threat landscape. Today, we'll address some of the most pressing questions in industry and explore the nuanced challenge of secure firmware development for embedded systems. This isn't just theory. This is about how we as an industry close security gaps, protect critical infrastructure, and design systems that stand up to both current and future threats. Gentlemen, welcome. I mentioned a couple times this is a very specialized topic. I think that while we'll probably lose most people that don't know what firmware is within about 30 seconds of now, let's take a stab at defining firmware and embedded systems for the audience. Mick, do you want to kick that off?
Sure. So embedded systems really are computers that are much smaller form factor, lower processing power, and are meant to be used as part of an overall ecosystem. So you'll have things like flow control sensors in a industrial control environment. Well, that flow control sensor, that embedded system needs to have an operating system, it needs to have applications part of it, and the firmware is what drives the logics on that particular device.
Jake, anything to add? That sounded like a pretty good
No,
definition to me.
I was gonna say that's as good as it's gonna get for me. So yeah, love it.
So I guess when thinking about embedded systems and specifically firmware, because I know that there is embedded systems that run software as well, right?
Mhm.
And have different logical, ladder logic or different approaches to actually putting programmatic terms or programmatic executions on top of the embedded system. But speaking specifically to the firmware, what are the primary challenges and trade-offs that as a firmware developer that developer faces when looking to integrating robust security into that firmware?
What a loaded question. Hey, I tell you what, we're gonna solve nuclear fusion too before the end
I
of the
just
hour.
said the trade-offs. I
Oh, the
didn't say to
trade-off.
They're
solve them.
massive.
Not how do
It's
we solve the problems. What are the
it's
trade-offs?
it's it's such a raw economics problem is really what it boils down to. You want to have, as the developer of these devices, you want to have the sun, the moon, and the stars. But the people who are purchasing these devices, they'll be buying them in some cases in the tens of thousands of units, and they want to pay the dead minimum. And the gulf between those two is forever irreparable. Like, you're never going to resolve that. And so every single problem that we have in the embedded space is a result of that gulf. That's it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
everything from here on out really is we're going to talk about how you mitigate that gap, or at least try to.
Yeah, I would mention, one of the things that we see consistently in embedded device security and firmware security more generally. When I think firmware, by the way, I think it's useful when talking about firmware security to separate firmware that's running on, on like I have firmware on my graphics card, I have firmware on my network card. I like to separate that from firmware and embedded devices and IoT devices because it's a world of difference. To Mick's point, there is that financial trade-off. It's not always just financial too. There's environmental aspects, right? Where it's not just the cost of the device, it's the physical footprint of the device. It's how much heat can the device generate. Battery life, right? I mean, if I have a device that needs to run on battery, these are all things that lead us to find security environments in many embedded device areas that look like they came out of something that was a decade or two old. Yeah, I mean, simple things like, you step back and say, well, ASLR, address space layout randomization, has been table stakes in just table stakes in consumer and enterprise operating systems for 2 decades. It's not uncommon to find embedded devices that don't use ASLR because they're squeezing out that last, 0.5%, yeah, of battery life. Well,
Mhm.
0.5% or 0.1% or whatever the number is that you want to argue, I'm sure they've measured it and right is, um, doesn't sound like a lot, right? But that literally can be the difference between meeting the requirement, right, for the actual deliverable, or not, right? And so we see a lot of these trade-offs that are made consistently in the space.
Yeah, one thing that's important to remember is a lot of these embedded systems are so minimal. Many people don't realize that the processing power that we take for granted just can't be. There's different classes of embedded devices, and some of the smallest ones are effectively like a paperclip with a bunch of resistors on it. Like, they have almost no processing power. I'm talking like they would be, if you compare them to like a 286, the 286 would literally outclass them.
Mhm.
And that's, I mean, that's what, 45-year-old technology.
So just to kind of like align this, because again, I'm trying to balance between wanting to immediately ask nerdy questions about this and trying to like apply this to a broader audience. And I'm going to try to do both because I can't help myself. But for the business question, I would say, do these trade-offs have kind of vertical industrial I would say groupings, right? So if you were to look at consumer IoT versus like critical infrastructure and water pipes and power generation and healthcare and name whatever others. Are there any clusters of these trade-offs that seem to kind of jump out at you as like, well, when you're thinking of this particular industry, and one that I've been talking about a lot lately is space and
Mhm.
satellite and associated technologies, because for various reasons I keep finding myself in discussions to talk about doing security in space, and there's
Mhm.
somebody in the audience that always says, well, we should just apply the stig to our space systems. And my first thought is like, well, that's a really good way to have lots of space garbage crashing into the ocean, is to try to do that. But like, that's one where I think about power, system longevity, incredibly constrained communications. Those are some of the kind of trade-offs that I think about in that particular environment. But for you guys, like, what business realm do you think has kind of an interesting grouping of those types of constraints?
Gosh.
So I'll throw one out that I think is really interesting, and it's medical devices, right? And one of the reasons that I think medical devices are really interesting from a security perspective is that you cannot eliminate in the vast majority of them, or many of them at least, involved in clinical care, you can't presume physical security of the device,
Mhm.
right? And so unlike, for instance, space, where absent me getting an X-37B or something, and going into low Earth orbit, I'm not going to have physical access to said device, right?
Mhm.
And even then, by the way, I'm not going to space, and definitely not on a Boeing rocket. Last, I mean, not on a SpaceX rocket either, if we're being frank. But alas, in the medical device space, not only do you have huge impacts, right? Obviously, for getting something wrong, you can't count on physical security. And there's also a very heavy, although this is not necessarily unique to med, there's a very heavy real time operating system being a little bit late in pacing someone's heart is not okay, right? As opposed to being a little bit late in rendering my web page. Right?
Yeah, each vertical has their own. I think that the medical ones probably where more attention should be given, and thankfully the FDA is getting really impressively good very quickly. Like it's a complete tale of two cities from how it used to be even just a couple
Yeah.
of years ago. And I'm gonna give if there's any FDA regulators listening, like hell yeah, keep it going. But each market vertical has their own, like, issues, like, anything in the retail and hospitality space has the same physical access issues. Manufacturing, my god, that can be a nightmare because there's plenty of systems that they are deploy and they will never, ever, ever phone back in, ever. And so, like, I can't imagine the amount of pressure that would be to develop a system that you fire off and it never ever comes back and it has to operate flawlessly 24 by 7 365 with zero outage forever for like 20 years. Are you kidding me? So like there's each vertical has their own like special hell that they deal with. I think power and water don't get enough credit. Those are very challenging.
Another one that I think of that has slightly more regularity of updates than something that literally never gets updated, but not a lot more, is weather detection apparatuses. Because you get buoys that are living off of effectively 4D cell batteries and a solar charger, which like it
That's if
needs to
you're
be
lucky.
built in a way where like, oh, we got cloud cover, so that one's just
Yeah.
gone. And there's really it's all RF, right? That they're
Mhm.
using to transmit back, and it's like very I think some of them are bidirectional now, but I don't think many of them. I think most of them are like one way, like
Most
you're
of
either
them are.
get this transmission or you don't, you get the next one kind of thing. And they built and in that case, unlike a medical device, unlike a water valve or a power generation station where like you can't just look at a bigger picture and be like, oh, it's fine if that one failed. We've got like weather detection is based on a intricate lattice of redundancies for that reason. But it is one that I've recently thought about that I've never had to before, and I didn't realize just how many buoys are sitting in the ocean that are effectively like have less processing power than my son's radio controlled car that we bought for $40 on Amazon.
Mhm.
So that is always interesting to me. So when looking at companies that need to build this type of firmware and looking at and I'm trying to kind of hop and skip between things that are discussed in software systems, right? And in traditional cloud, even installed enterprise software, there's a pretty significant move towards secure by design philosophies,
Mhm.
towards integrated tool chains for the iterative development of those things so that the tool chain is trusted
Mhm.
and therefore the software that's going through it outside of logic errors is reasonably trusted. How do companies follow a methodology or framework to effectively build security into their firmware from the ground up? Like, what would you tell a company, and especially now that there's just so many more companies that are entering the space of specialized hardware. There aren't a
Mhm.
lot of people that have done this before and have gone through rigorous like testing from NOAA or NASA or some of the intel agencies that kind of like test to make sure that this thing that they're putting on a satellite is in fact fit for flight. So you have these micro satellites that are getting a lot of attention. There's all of these new embedded systems that are being deployed, and they're hiring software developers to do it. They're hiring people that
Mhm.
have never built firmware before. So,
Mhm.
what would you tell those people to start? And I understand this is a big one, so I'm not expecting this to be a short answer.
Yeah. So the first thing there's really two things that I think are table stakes, and one will make sense, but I'm going to start with the lesser intuitive one. If you're going to be a serious contender in the firmware space, you have got to understand how certificates work. If
Yeah.
you cannot do certificates, if you cannot do certificate revocation, if you cannot do mutual TLS, study up, learn it, and get it. Because every device attack that regardless of market vertical, regardless of space, every device attack where we have had success during a pen test, almost all of the flaws started with improper cert handling. If I can get the cert, the entire chain of trust starts falling apart and everything's shot to sunshine. And I saw Jake's reaction. He's wholly in agreement. For the life of me, we're not talking about that enough in the industry.
Mm. No. No, that's it. And if I can go another step further, you're talking about certificates, right? I'm still dealing with folks that are even in the last year, right? And I feel like this is something that should be not in the last year, where they're like, don't worry, we factory embedded the symmetric key in our secure element. And I'm like,
Oh,
no, no. And they're using that to protect everything else. And I'm like, I, this is really where I come back to, okay, the second one of these devices falls off the back of a truck, right? There are folks with, I mean, like in not APT grade folks, right? But like hobbyist level folks that have
mhm,
access to what used to be like really high grade scanning electron microscopes, but now are hobbyist and $15,000 microscopes. And at that point, they're getting your secure element, right?
yeah,
Be real about it, right? And so even there, right, to Mick's point, if you're storing certificates in your secure elements, and we're doing asymmetric crypto as God intended, then I mean, seriously, right? Like
yeah,
it's
yeah.
2025, this discussion's over. You being like, I have a secret key versus I'm managing certificates is just not a debate we should be having. And so, even there's at least a path to revocation and making sure you've got a plan around revoking and
Mhm.
replacing certificates once the devices are in the field is absolutely critical. Absolutely critical.
Yep. The other thing too that developers need to understand is that you absolutely positively must get comfortable with using virtualized embedded devices, and you have to do better abuse testing. In my we're a small we're 7 years old at InfoSec Innovations, the company I work for. We've got about, I think, $28,000 of virtualization hardware between a couple clusters of machines and a big NAS. We will beat the tar out of an embedded system in a virtualized environment literally hundreds of millions of times before we actually begin a pen test. And so when we start doing things like looking to do a voltage glitch attack, people are like, well, why would you even know to do that? Well, we emulated what would happen if we did that. We know the values and the ranges to start doing. We know where on the bus to give it a try because we did the grind. A lot of people think that doing embedded security and hardware security is somehow very like engineering. And I hate to burst the bubble. It's actually, there's a lot more grind to it than many people appreciate. And the faster you can throw stuff on a wall, the more stuff you can throw at the wall, the better chances you will have of finding something. It is absolutely a hobbyist level that you need. You do not need APT grade equipment or techniques.
But to Mick's point about the virtualization, though, I think that's really a critical point. I don't see enough attention paid to this either, right? I remember doing some work, a couple of years back on a couple of past life kind of stuff, and again, problem number one is be able to virtualize a particular chipset, right? So work out how, and it's always QEMU. Be real, right? Because why wouldn't it be? And by the way, I spelled it out there for the audience, not for not because it's my normal. But all that said, it's open source. We can go and build our own chipsets for virtualization. And often I will mention one of the bane of my existence is getting the timing correct. Now, I feel like it's trying to play one of the like old Exodus Ultima like on a DOS emulator, and it's like, oh, the emulation works fine. That's not the problem. The
Yeah.
problem is that it's running at light speed, right?
Yeah.
Because and so getting the timing right. But to Mick's point, this allows you to figure out where to go and execute specific attacks, right? And so we just do not pay enough attention to that in the industry at all anymore. So
I was just going to say the first thing you mentioned on the certificate side, I think almost all developers need to go back to school about how certificates work. I mean, and I'm not trying to call out because there's plenty that do, but I've seen, especially in the government, where certificates are so incredibly well issued and well revoked in a way that no private company ever would, right? Because in the DoD anyway, we built Rapids offices. There are about 1,000 of them across the country. I'm guessing they're somewhere in the tens of millions of dollars a year just in staffing, where the only job is to check two forms of ID and make sure you are who you say you are. And for the longest time, I had in my brain that identity was a digital transformation problem because all of these people just don't know how to use certificates. All these developers are just grabbing distinguished names from headers in web requests because no one's properly knows how to implement SAML and no one properly even knows how to use OpenIDC and all of the ways that we do that. So we just dumb it down where you're just doing a basic header request and and then I realized, oh wait, I'm got this completely backwards. Only the government has spent this much money in issuing identity properly. And identity is such an important and it's because identity is such an important security problem and machine identity and entity identity and all these non-person identities are even harder to conceptualize. But it really comes down to most people haven't read the X509 spec and most people don't understand the tooling around it. And it is not just in firmware, but especially in firmware, where at least in human identity, you have a concept where you can understand identification of the person and a project manager and a CISO and all the people up the chain can kind of, even if they don't understand the protocols, they understand the importance. But it is so much more abstract when you're talking about non-person and device identity. And I understand why the whole, hey, we've embedded a key in the hardware thing scares you, Jake. But I also, while I'm not the best certificate engineer, I've read the specs and I understand what they're supposed to do. And I bet you many people that are security professionals, many of them making a ton of money a year in Fortune 500 companies, would hear that pitch and go, okay, sounds good, right? Because they haven't conceptualized why that's a problem.
Yeah.
And so I guess this is a good follow-up, which is because we talked about certificate and revocation. Let's talk about firmware updates in general for a second. And obviously we've talked about certain environments where that's just realistically not going to be a thing, and that's a totally different threat model. But let's talk about where it is. What are some good ways for these organizations to establish secure mechanisms to do those updates? And what are some pitfalls that result in what are effectively supply chain attacks?
Wow. So I'll try running at this. I think that one of the things that many professionals that live in this space kind of get surprised at one point in their journey is that any IoT device of any like worth using has some surprisingly cool functions in it. So one is when you do a firmware update, the firmware writes to a different spot. It never overwrites itself. It's not like how you patch a traditional PC. So you have the firmware that's running, and then in another spot, it's getting the update. And then assuming that the update passes a signature check, it will then be considered a good firmware, and then it will be selected to boot that new firmware at restart, at the next restart. And so, really, a lot of what you need to do from a user of these devices is make sure that you have at least one of each device in your environment, and then just test the firmware update to see if it behaves as expected. And then the thing that's really tough, and not many orgs have the intestinal fortitude to do this, and Jake and I were talking about this the other day, is what happens if mid firmware update the device powers off? Because then all bets are off. And that's when you have like things like corrupted firmwares, and it can get real ugly. And in some cases, the restoration process can be as ghastly as having to have somebody come physically to like a serial port and reflash the firmware. And like going back to your oceanic buoys, for instance, like you would literally have to put somebody on a boat in that instance.
One of the things I jump in and note about the Mick said, you mentioned the new firmware passing a signature validation. And I want to call out there first off, now I'm not even going to the we don't even bother doing signatures because we're just that smart. Although I've seen that recently where they're like, don't worry, it's protected with HTTPS. And I'm like, what do you mean? Right? They're like, we only download it over HTTPS. And I'm like, woo, okay. Well, I can't begin to help you there, right? Well, I mean, I can. We got to go back to basics. But I do see signature validation problems where
Mhm.
somebody will validate and look at make sure that it's something's digitally signed. They'll look at the common name for the certificate or something like that. Yeah, and of course that's all bad, right? The shortcuts that people take and I know Mick could write a book full of stuff he's seen here too, shortcuts people take in signature validation. There is one way to do it right and hundreds of other ways to do it wrong. This is not a place where you skimp on the design pattern or you just absolutely introduce a whole range of vulnerabilities. One other thing that I'd like to throw out there too is from an attack perspective is that I'm not always looking for with embedded devices. I'm not always looking for specifically like how do I upgrade to rogue firmware or what have you? In many cases, I can gain execution on the device until it's rebooted, which through some other vulnerability over the wire or sometimes locally, most often over the wire. And if I can gain execution locally, particularly for a lot of these devices, like we think about my laptop reboots every couple of days, typically even a daily driver, I maybe at least every month for Patch Tuesday, that kind of thing. And some of these embedded devices are up for years, right?
Yeah.
Without, particularly in industrial applications, are
Uh-huh.
up for years. And so, me gaining execution but not having quote unquote persistence through reboot is a distinction without a difference in many of those cases.
So all I can think of is the time a friend of mine started a firmware update on his Tesla, and it rolled into a underground parking garage in the middle of that. And he had to get a really interesting and expensive tow truck to pull it to where there was I
Yeah.
mean, like, because it was just like it was able to be fixed remotely, but not in the garage. So
Wow.
it's and it is kind of important when we talk about these because we're getting into the super, I don't want to say edge casey, because I actually think that what we're talking about is the majority use case of embedded systems. There's so many small ones, but we're talking about the really small ones that people don't think about. But people don't realize the level of embedded systems that are in their cars,
Oh, yeah.
especially the newer electrics. Tesla's a whole other level of like amount of technology packed into a vehicle, but like even Ford EVs, Honda EVs, they're just starting to put so much more tech in the car itself. And I'm all for that. I really enjoy the technology in the car personally, but I go into that understanding that like one, we're a two-car family and only one of them works like that because for the same reason why I have another laptop, like I can the newer and whiz bangier it gets, the more things that can go wrong. And I just think that people don't really realize the level of embedded systems that are really becoming a part of their everyday life. Even although all phones had firmware from back in StarTAC flip phone days, but that firmware was incredibly specific and it did one thing. Every time my iPhone gets messed up, my first thought is like, why did I buy into this terrible idea of a phone being effectively as powerful as every computer I've had in the last 5 years? And like, and I use it for so many other things. I know the trade-off, it's fair, but every time it doesn't work when I expect it to, I am pissed. And I just think that it's not something that people understand when they're kind of sitting there thinking, oh, embedded systems, well, I have a cyber guy for that. It's your phone, it's your car. In a lot of places, it's your locks on the doors of your house. And certainly in every hotel, it's the lock on every hotel room door. I just think that that is lost on people when we talk about updating. It's not this esoteric, like, oh, we need to download firmware to a USB stick to put it on an air gap computer to plug the device into. I mean, it's also that, and that's a lot of the use cases, but we've gotten it to a point where, and to Apple's credit and to Google's credit, it works most of the time, right? Where like I get a thing that's like, hey, update this new iOS. And like, and I get that's not entirely, that's a little mix of messaging because that's software and firmware
It's software
probably
and
in
firmware.
every
It's both.
update that's happening. It's usually a comprehensive thing. But I just leave it on my nightstand plugged in, and most of the time it works. And when it doesn't, to Mick's point earlier about what happens in the middle of the way, I've had iPhone updates fail. I get a message when I wake up that says this update failed, and here it is working on the old OS. Like, kudos to these big consumer firms for thinking of that. I can't imagine it wasn't through massive amounts of failure and consumer complaints, because there are very few things in this life that exist that are not that way. But that's just something that I want to highlight for listeners, because I think that we it's so easy for me to think about embedded systems in this incredibly unique to environments that most people don't have to think about. And I think that as soon as you mentioned the firmware updates, I'm like, yeah, this is something that everyone should understand is happening in their lives. So speaking of that, we're talking about things being balanced in everyday lives. In software worlds and in network worlds, there are ISO standards, there's NIST standards, there's SOC 2. Are there security standards for embedded devices that you would recommend that companies start to look at when they look at assessing their maturity in embedded device security?
So I got to tell you, the one area that gives me a lot of hope, you should look up what sort of regs there are that the US Food and Drug Administration has on medical devices, specifically for what are newer devices. The term they use is de novo, and those de novo requirements are amazing. It literally walks you through like what type of like what class of device it is and what the expectations are in terms of protections. Something that Jake mentioned earlier on, address space layout randomization. Certain classes of devices that's not needed or called for, but on others it's expected and can be enabled. I think that would be the best one.
Oh
There's
yeah, I mean,
NIST has a really good one. It's 800. I forget which 800 series it is off the top of my head.
800, 160.
Yes, that sounds about right.
I was thinking about ISO 19678 as well as another decent standard, but that's specifically on the protection of the firmware slash BIOS itself, and doesn't get into there's a lot that it doesn't cover, and I think that that actually may be part of the problem is that we don't have today in the industry. There's not an OWASP top 10 for firmware. To a lesser or greater extent, it kind of makes sense because when we Mick, I suspect you deal with the same thing. When somebody says, "Hey, let's do a test for this firmware," my first question is, "What do you mean by that?" Because you know, for some people, what they really mean is, "I want you to test the Linux operating system, the time,
Yep,
the busy box, right?
yep.
That we've jammed into this, it'll be running on top of, running on top of the bootloader, and lots of other folks actually mean the bootloader, and then everywhere in between, and so I think I think that lack of standardization of even how we use the word firmware probably leads to the problem of there's not a checklist for devs to follow. It's very much like, how do I secure Windows, right? And you're like,
Yeah,
which part of it do you mean?
right.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I feel like these standards are evolving again as a reaction to how embedded they have become in our lives. And like, I don't know much about the FDA standards, but I am pleased and delighted to find out that that's the first one you went to, because when I hear about my grandfather before he passed had a pacemaker, and he talked about how cool it was that his doctor modified it via Bluetooth. And
Mhm.
my first thought was, that is scary as shit. I don't want the blue, like, I want you to cut me open every time. I don't want the Bluetooth pacemaker. But I would imagine with that level of gravity coming into these devices,
Yeah.
and with the convenience of, and I totally get the convenience of why having some very low power, difficult to, I would say difficult to hack, because that is totally not true about Bluetooth. Difficult, able to be reasonably secured and reasonably purpose built, I think is the better way of saying it for Bluetooth.
Yeah.
But I totally get the utility of it, right? Because before that, it was like a minor surgical procedure to hook a wire into a place to make updates,
Mhm.
and every time you cut somebody open, at the very least, you're looking at a risk of infection. Forget all the other risks that come
Sure.
into that are much stronger and much worse. But you know, infections are very preventable, but zero is a way better risk number with Bluetooth than whatever the fraction of a percent it is for a good doctor to do it. So I am not surprised. I am a little surprised, but I'm pleasantly surprised to hear that that's the first place you went, and in terms of a reference. And I really hope that other standards bodies and people that kind of do this for a living follow suit, and also do it in a way that's very tailorable, because what you embed in your chest and what you put on a satellite are very different things, and
True.
reasonably should be secured very differently. And so it does come down to threat model, industry grouping, cost to benefit ratio, etc.
Yep. Can I jump in though? There was something you said that I can't let slide, and Jake will start laughing because I've gone on this rant with him in the past.
I'll take it.
You mentioned Bluetooth, right? When it comes to embedded systems, not all Bluetooth is created equal. So some of these devices are very long lived and are using the pre Bluetooth 3 standard, which is atrocious in terms of security.
Mhm.
But things that are after Bluetooth 3 are actually reasonably okay. Like there are attacks, there's nothing's perfect, but depending on your risk model, Bluetooth actually might not be that bad. And, that's, we're not even getting into things like Bluetooth low energy, which is, my goodness, that can be very challenging to attack because the surface area, the exposure that you have to be physically at the thing. So it's a very nuanced area.
Well,
It's
and
funny
that
you
was why
mentioned
I
that.
oh, go ahead, Jake, sorry.
No, go ahead. I was say it's funny you mentioned that. Two quick points here, right? BTLE, obviously, for all the reasons Mick mentioned. One, there are lots of things that aren't supported through the standard anyway, and so the attack surface is already smaller. I want to make sure that we cover that piece as well, right? Not just
Mhm.
you have to be physically closer to it, and so it is an acceptable protocol for a lot of use cases. Second thing I'll mention is El Jefe. I don't know if you know Mick. You know El Jefe at Microsoft. He consistently, every time I see him at Black Hat or DEF CON, comes back to me. He's like, remember that year, Black Hat? And you walked up to me and were like, dude, can't believe you're sitting out here on a Bluetooth headset. And I'm like, yeah, I do remember that. It was 2009. Like security has changed dramatically. I
Mhm.
don't think twice about, that risk. But again, to Mick's point, it's a completely different, it's almost like we need to have rebranded. It's like if Ford continued on with the Pinto and expected us to want to drive those around, right? For whatever reason, we just haven't rebranded. Well, I guess for whatever reason, it's a standard. But again, foundationally different threat models.
Well,
So
and that was why I caught myself, because I first said, "Oh, Bluetooth is fine," and I was like, "No, I'm gonna say Bluetooth is a reasonable thing that can be
Well, yeah.
tailored
And
appropriately." But I do think that that's an important waterline to draw, is pre-Bluetooth 3 and post. And I
yeah,
also think that the way that they allow you to tailor it with the low energy and the proximity significantly changes the threat surface, right? And that's
100%.
I enjoy that about the problem space and the way that the solution is kind of presented, because yeah, it doesn't it when I first heard it, my first thought was Bluetooth attack, et cetera, and
Mhm.
all these things. And then I looked, and I didn't know about the low energy standard at the time my grandfather mentioned this. And this is 6 years ago. So it's like was still kind of emerging, right? It wasn't
Mhm.
yet like a thing that everyone knew about. And when I looked it up, I was just like, oh, well, that's interesting. I mean, there might still be problems with it that I don't understand, but that attacker is going to be sitting, like, unless your doctor is also the attacker, in which case they have admin device, they got to be standing over you with the stethoscope to like
Yeah.
effectively execute an attack. So that is one of the things that as you start looking at the nuance of threat modeling an embedded system, especially a medical device one. It's the number of levers, the number of things to think about. It's incredibly nuanced. And that's why I made the comment I did about security bodies, because it's so easy for everyone to just kind of be like, we're going to accept zero risk. We're going to put everything in this prescriptive high watermark standard, and then everyone should feel safe. And then when your pacemaker suddenly is like the size of a baseball, because the only way to do all of these could be like, everyone's got these weird appendages on their chest because, well, we had to meet this standard. Like that's and industry sucks at this. I'm gonna say industry always wants a prescriptive standard because they want to avoid the legal liability of interpreting a standard. And the government, on the other hand, is really good at throwing out this non-deterministic standard, and you don't need to look very far to find one, and then just hold you responsible for understanding what they meant when they wrote it. So and this isn't, I'm not trying to be doom and gloom. It's just a hard problem. And the more critical and life supporting the system, the harder the problem is.
Can I pivot off of that real quick on,
Sure.
this is one of the reasons you talk about standards. I am a huge fan of the European Union Product Liability Directive and the way it's written. And if you haven't read this yet, or if you're not familiar with this, it's because it just got published by the EU late last year. Member states have up to 2 years to adopt it into their laws. And so it's B2C only, right? So business to consumer only. But they basically future proofed the standards for how you can avoid any liability. And then they say by using state of the art techniques at the time that the software or hardware, right? In this case, we're talking about firmware, was ultimately released. So they anticipated. I love the way it's written. Granted, most businesses don't, because that puts them in the position of figuring out, in this constantly moving target, right? What is the standard for state of the art right now? But I really think that's the appropriate way to go. And I rarely say this, but bravo EU, good job on that. So yeah.
It's getting more and more common between USB-C universal charging standards and about
Yeah.
where I agree with you that it's a weird feeling, but it's a weird feeling I'm becoming more and more familiar with, because without making this a political discussion, US regulators are not in the business of pushing technology companies to do much these days. And good for the EU, because most people won't want to build a US device and an EU device. So we've kind of forced the quote unquote cafe standards by having the EU do that. And I think that is a good thing. It's interesting that you mentioned that, because in a lot of ways, and I'm just putting this together because Mick mentioned the FDA, that's how food safety works. Food safety is based on current science, current capabilities, but the rules basically give you a level of protection as a food producer if you're following those latest standards, because mistakes happen and food is a living thing and it kills people sometimes. But in the US, there's a criminal liability to the CEO of the food company. There are CEOs of food companies in jail for listeria outbreaks that were preventable and that were following those standards. And I would imagine that as we get more and more cybertronic as a human race and start putting more and more of these devices in us, there's going to be resulting deaths, especially as they become more optional and performance enhancing versus medical and life supporting,
Mhm.
because those are very different standards of liability in US law. So I'd imagine we're going to start seeing more and more of that in this space. So I think it's going to be interesting to keep an eye on. So with that, I know we're coming up on time here, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I could have kept going for a little bit longer, but I won't do that to you guys. Thank you both so much for coming. This is great.
Can I give a parting little thing?
Absolutely.
So here's the deal. Don't listen to the haters. It's not all doom and gloom. You can win at defense on the embedded systems. You just have to very carefully plan out what attacks you're going to defend against and hold the vendors to account. I mean, one thing that you need to realize is that the technology is advancing and there's things that we can do now that we couldn't until just recently. I was on a a physical device pen test, and we were able to extract the firmware through the JTAG. For those of you who don't know, it's an interface that allows you to update the system. It's a very common thing. Look it up, JTAG. It's spelled exactly as you think it is. But one of the things that the vendor did in response is they said, "Oh well, for I think it was like something like 3 cents more a chip, we will use a different chipset, and after we flash the firmware in the factory, they will do a series of checks, and then they send a voltage that burns fuses out. So
Oh,
the JTAG is still populated. You still see it there, but if you hook up a logic probe, there is no electricity at all to the JTAG interface. Mic drop. So
that's
you
awesome and
can
evil.
win. You can win. Ask the vendors. Try to push them for better. I
That's
was
awesome and
floored.
evil,
I've
man.
never seen that in a consumer grade device. Like, I've
Yeah.
seen similar stuff in military gear, and I
Mhm.
can't talk about that much, but I was just absolutely floored.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, with that, I will echo that. Demand better from your vendors. Regulators should demand better from vendors, and consumers need to get informed. So hopefully we kept a couple of consumers on the line long enough that they're ready to ask some questions of their vendors and of their elected representatives that kind of create these rules. So thank you both for joining me. I'm going to want to do this again. So we'll figure that out.
I would love that. This was a hoot.
Yeah.
Thanks,
All
gentlemen.
about it, man.
Uh
So